Michael Moorcock, thank you to be here with us today. It's a great
you.
pleasure. Thank you very much.
Merci.
Donc je poserai les questions en français et à la fin de l'interview, on aura à peu près une quinzaine de minutes pour vos propres questions. On vous passera un micro dans la salle. Si vous le voulez bien, nous allons commencer avec votre carrière passée, avec vos débuts. Est-ce que vous pourriez nous parler en fait des magazines Thousand Adventures et particulièrement le magazine New Worlds? Comment est-ce que ces expériences en fait ont été importantes dans votre carrière comme écrivain? Qu'est-ce qu'elles vous ont apporté plus tard comme écrivain?
Well, I was. My father left my mother and myself in I think it was 1945. As soon as the war was over, he left, and he left 4 books behind, and those 4 books were 2 by Edgar Rice Burroughs. One was, I think, The Mastermind of Mars. And the second was The Son of Tarzan. They weren't the beginnings of anything, they were just there. Plus George Bernard Shaw and another book. And so these were the first long books, adult books, that I ever read. And I'd read them before I went to school, so I was already enjoying them. And it gave me a great taste for Edgar Rice Burroughs. And so as a child, I read every Burroughs book I could find, and became such an enthusiast that I began to do a fanzine, an Edgar Rice Burroughs fanzine called Burroughsiana. And one day I was 15, and I went to interview the editor of the magazine Thousand Adventures, which actually had its origins in Italy. It was part of the Mondadori group. And the British publisher was actually reprinting the Italian version, which was also in French. They were, you still see them around. They're very large comics. And at some point, the deal broke down with Mondadori, and they started to publish it as an American-style size comic, but with text. About 50% was written, printed stories, and
Of Tarzan?
Yeah, no, not of Tarzan. They were just general short stories. And then there was another strip at the back. The Tarzan strip was at the front. There's another strip at the back, usually a Western or something like that. Anyway, I interviewed the editor, who was an old hack, an old cynic. And when I got back, I wrote about my interview, and he hated it. And he swore, never let him come near me again, never let him come into the offices. But everybody else working there hated him. So as soon as he'd left, his successor called me, and he said, "How would you like to be the assistant editor of Tarzan Adventures?" Originally, he wanted me to write features for the magazine and stories. So I started writing for it.
As a critic.
Sorry?
As a critic, comme critique.
Just little stories and pieces about Burroughs, because the Martian stories and so on. And he also told me that if I took a job working as the assistant editor, he was leaving in a month's time to travel, and so I would become editor when he left. So by the time I was 16, I was already working for the magazine. By the time I was 17, I was the editor of the magazine. And it was a national, and the I put more fantasy and science fiction into it. So it became a sort of juvenile pulp magazine with mostly science fiction, fantasy, and I commissioned new strips, science fiction strips. And the circulation began to go up, so they were very pleased. I mean, and obviously I'd hit a moment when people were beginning to read that kind of thing more. And so I wrote a lot of, my first fantasy series was written for Tarzan Adventures. And I became a working journalist after that. I mean, I did all kinds of work until I was asked to work on another magazine called Sexton Blake Library, which was a little bit like, what's his name? Harry, the French, Harry Dixon. It's the same kind of institution, and they started in the 1890s, and they were still going by the 1960s, but in a very different form, more sophisticated form. So I became assistant editor on that magazine, and then worked on various comics at the company, which was Fleetway Publications, IPC, which it was the biggest comic publisher in the world at that time. They published enormous numbers of comics and other publications, women's magazines, and all sorts of magazines. So I got a lot of experience writing comics. I'd never written comics before, but I learnt my trade writing them. And I actually think it did me a lot of good learning to write for comics, because
Why
because it teaches you to condense well, to leave out the unnecessary things in a story. It teaches you to structure well. You learn how to structure a story. We had very strict ideas about structure. They had to be, well done. So I learned all of that, and then one day when I was working at Fleetway, Harry Harrison, who was another science fiction writer, who was also writing comics for Fleetway, said to me, "I'm going across the road to the pub to meet Ted Carnell, who was the editor of 3 science fiction magazines, adult science fiction magazines." And I knew him already. I'd sold him a few very short stories. And so we went to the pub. And while we were talking, Ted Carnell, the editor, said, "What I'd really like to see in the magazine is maybe, one of those fantasy stories like Conan or something like that." And I said, "Well, I'm sure I could do it." And I really only saw it as another job in a series of jobs as a journalist. So I first of all thought he meant a Conan story, and I tried to write something like a Conan story, but then he told me that isn't what he wanted. What he wanted was something new from me. Mm-hmm. So I decided I'd try to do something as different as possible from what little there was. I mean, there was Howard, Leiber, Tolkien. Paul Anderson had written a book called The Broken Sword, which I was very influenced by. But there wasn't a great deal at all available, and the idea was that it didn't sell, so nobody commissioned it any. So anyway, I decided I'd do this as original as I could, make the story as original as I could. And I wrote the first Elric story, thinking that that was the end of it. You know, it was a story, I earned a little bit of money and didn't expect any more to come of it. And then he said, well, you know, this one seems to have sold very well. Would you do me another? And so I said, yes, of course.
Was it a conscious, est-ce que c'était un processus conscient de votre part de vraiment vouloir faire quelque chose de complètement différent, justement des héros de fantasy classiques, ou est-ce que c'était complètement inconscient, simplement vous n'aimiez pas les héros classiques de fantasy? Comment est-ce que ça s'est vraiment fait, cette construction de ce personnage de Elric, justement?
Well, I'd grown out of them. I'd been some time since I'd originally read fantasy, and I really didn't think I was going to read anymore. I was reading, I don't know, Camus by that time. You know, I just wasn't interested. So I really had to draw from myself the writers I was reading, who were at the time largely existentialist writers. I mean, it was just happened to be my enthusiasm of the moment. So I gave him a kind of existentialist or existential character, just because, you know, that's what I was interested in. And again, they just continued to be more and more popular. So I kept writing them, and I enjoyed writing them. I mean, it wasn't that I wrote them cynically, but I at the same time had no intention to be a fantasy writer. I had absolutely no intention. I had no ambition to write science fiction or fantasy any more than just as occasional stories, but not as a career.
Vous pensiez à votre carrière comme à celle d'un éditeur et un journaliste plutôt qu'à celle d'un écrivain, c'est ça?
Well, actually, I was interested in politics, and I'd thought that probably politics was where I would go. I really, my first wife was very, very unhappy with me because when after we'd been married a while, she said to me, "Why are you a writer? I thought I was going to marry a politician." And I did work for a while for a political party, for the Liberal Party, but it was really, again, just a job. I wrote pamphlets and speeches and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean, I was a proper political writer. But really that was before I got married, because my then wife said, "Unless you have a job, my mother won't let you marry me." So I had to get a proper job, and a job for the Liberal Party was going, and so I just took it. But I only worked for it until after I was married, and then I left. So it was about a year, so and for a long time I was just a working journalist with political ideas to get into politics, but I lost respect for politics by working for the Liberal Party. Once I'd been exposed to real politics, I didn't see it as a particularly good career. So, and I freelanced until I was offered the job of editing New Worlds, the science fiction magazine. Which again, I didn't read science fiction anymore. So the first thing I had to do when I got the job was to buy a whole run of science fiction magazines, because I had read very little science fiction. I got a run of Astounding and so on. And by the time I'd read it, I thought, this is crap. I mean, I really didn't think much of it.
Pourquoi c'était de la mauvaise qualité comme ça? Qu'est-ce qui faisait que c'était de la mauvaise qualité selon vous à cette époque? Pourquoi?
Well, it was poorly written. It had no real literary aspirations. It had no style, most of it. I mean, there were a few people. Ray Bradbury was one. and a few others like that. Most of them in the very garish pulps, the real pulp science fiction, which I far preferred to the more respectable science fiction magazines. Planet stories, for instance, startling stories, thrilling wonder stories. These all had stories by Bradbury, but also by Lee Brackett, who was a friend of Bradbury's and had helped him and became a friend of mine. And Lee Brackett wrote, as you probably know, The Big Sleep and various other Howard Hawks movies. And she became a good friend of mine, but not at that point, but a little bit later. Soon after I took over New Worlds, I met Lee and Ed, and we became great friends. But I was actually encouraging people to write stuff that was completely at odds with either what she wrote or what I wrote at the time. I was very disappointed in science fiction, but I was equally disappointed in mundane fiction, in social fiction, literary fiction.
Why that?
Well, I felt it had become moribund. I felt that that thematically it had become predictable. That it had become that literary fiction was just as much a genre, predictable genre as genre fiction, even more so in some cases. And I felt that science fiction, or the techniques of science fiction, and some of the subject matter and some of the way in which science fiction dealt with social issues could be incorporated into literary fiction. And I had a friend, J.G. Ballard, who's he and another writer called Barry Bailey were my closest friends, and we all felt that we could do something with science fiction, but not just write it as it existed, with all of the rationalizations which we didn't like, and we found it boring. The images really were what attracted us to science fiction as much as anything. And early on, I really saw myself as an imagist more than anything, a symbolic writer, interest in symbolism. And both Ballard and I were both very interested in psychology and Freud and Jung and so on. So we really together formed the policy for the three of us, the policy for New Worlds, before I ever took over New Worlds. And from then on, really, I tried to encourage writers to expand their horizons, to write well, to write better, and to one piece of advice that I tended to give writers who asked me, how should they start writing science fiction, was to stop reading science fiction completely and just do their own thing. Because I felt, again, that with a genre, you tend to get a Xerox effect, the same kind of story being repeated over and over. So that's how I
justement, vous parlez du fait de répéter constamment les mêmes schémas pour créer de la science-fiction ou de la fantasy. Et justement, dans votre carrière, on peut voir que vous avez vraiment abordé tous les genres de l'imaginaire, vraiment de la science-fiction plutôt classique, ou la fantasy qui est très très noire, des romans plutôt psychologiques, des romans parlant de religion, de voyage dans le temps, de l'autofiction aussi.
Westerns.
Excusez-moi.
Westerns.
Yes. Est-ce que c'est très important, justement, pour vous, de constamment changer de style, ou en tout cas de sujet, pour justement vous renouveler constamment?
I think it's to stop myself being bored. I get bored very easily, and so I always wanted to do something fresh that didn't didn't have the same things in it. Well, even the same attitudes, you know. I don't know why. I mean, I'm just like that. It's just my nature. I didn't have any particular argument with. I wasn't trying to stop people from reading that kind of science fiction that I didn't like, which many of them thought I was. I mean, I had a huge reaction from the science fiction fans of the day, who just hated me. I mean, they loathed everything I stood for, and said I was killing science fiction, you know, and so on. But I was publishing Spinrad and Szilagyi and Thomas Endish and
Arthur C. Clarke also.
And a little bit of Arthur. Arthur was a friend.
Okay.
But what Arthur published was not what I wanted to.
Yes.
What he wrote was not what I wanted to publish. But he didn't mind. I mean, we remained good friends all his life. But I only published, I think, 2 stories of Arthur's in the whole time. I published Thomas Pynchon, which was probably the first time and last time it ever appeared in a magazine of that kind. So I tended to publish people who perhaps hadn't read very much science fiction, but were attracted to it as a method of working. The magazine tended to be experimental, so although I always kept strong stories in there, like a serial that would keep the readers, more conservative readers, I always made it a platform for experimental writing. And that really was, at the time, it was 1964, and it was absolutely the right moment for doing what I was doing. I mean, the Beatles were coming out. The whole change in British culture had come about, and happily, I was part of that culture, and there was a very strong relationship between New World's International Times, which was an underground paper, Oz, which was another. We were all part of the same group editing, and we were all interested in rock and roll. Sorry.
Non, comment?
Non.
Oui, vous parlez justement du rock and roll et que vous, comme ça a été dit justement dans l'introduction, comment est-ce que vous avez intégré cette idée de musique justement dans votre œuvre? Parce que c'est vrai que dans plusieurs de vos œuvres, on parle de musique, on ressent la musique suit le fil de la narration. Comment est-ce que cette musique que vous avez interprétée, composée, a influencé votre œuvre en tant qu'écrivain?
I was interested in music as much as I was interested in writing. And very early on, I was in skiffle groups, which was the kind of early form of British rock and roll. I mean, almost everybody I know in rock and roll started in a skiffle group. And so I was doing that at the same time as I was doing all the other things.
Et vous avez envisagé une carrière de musicien plutôt que d'écrivain? Est-ce que vous avez essayé de vous lancer en tant que professionnel aussi dans la musique?
Oh yes. I made a record with EMI very early on, which was dreadful. I mean, it was absolutely appalling, and they'd never released it. And I'm so glad they never released it. It's extremely embarrassing if but I was in 2 bands. Most of the time I was doing writing. I was also doing music, performing music. But I decided when I was married that I had to determine. Well, I had 2 children very early on, and writing was a more secure way at that time of making a living. So I became more a writer than a musician. But there was always an element of I was always working with somebody on some kind of music, and by the late 60s, this is something that seemed to exist more in England than anywhere, certainly not in America. The science fiction world and the rock and roll world were very close. Almost all the rock and roll people read science fiction. Admittedly, most of the science fiction people at the time did not listen to rock and roll. I mean, they were a more conservative audience, I think. But there was a new audience which came up of people who saw both science fiction, fantasy, rock and roll as being part of the same culture which they could make their own. And part of the attraction was that, for me, was that science fiction, you could make it, there was nobody looking over your shoulder. There was no criticism, there were no courses taught, there was nothing. I mean, it was also regarded as a very low form of writing. And the same with rock and roll. And I've often made the comparison that we were experimenting all the time, because whenever you went into a studio, you never knew what you were going to come out of the studio with. In those days, I mean, you know, as with Buddy Holly, you might decide to bang a cardboard box, you know, for the rhythm, and it worked. So you never quite knew what you were going to get. And the same with the writing, particularly with New Worlds. You were never sure or the writers were never sure quite what was going to happen. But I did insist on well-structured material, because I believed that if you were going to experiment, you also had to know exactly what you were doing in the conventional sense before you.
Et c'est pour ça que vous arrivez à écrire aussi rapidement. J'ai lu que vous avez écrit de nombreux romans juste en 3 jours. C'est justement grâce à cette capacité à mettre en place une structure très solide qui vous permet après d'être libre pour développer le récit.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what it is. If you have the structure right, then you really don't have to do anything else except, well, I mean, if you have the right kind of imagination, and that's absolutely true. I would work out for, say, the Hawkmoon books. I wrote out a specific structure for them and wrote those in 3 days each. And the same with the Coram books, and not so much the Elric books, because they were more organically, they came about more organically, because I was writing them as short stories.
Et aussi peut-être parce que vous avez dit que Elric, c'est quand même le personnage avec lequel vous êtes le plus proche. C'est peut-être aussi pour ça que vous avez mis plus de temps pour écrire les romans de Elric.
Didn't take me so much longer. Okay. I still wrote them very quickly. Again, I think it was because I was a working journalist. I mean, you know, science fiction never paid anything like as well. Novels didn't pay as well as writing comics, for instance, or writing features. So I had to write a lot and fast to make it economic. This is when I was supporting my family and a lot of writers as well, because New Worlds did well to begin with, but then we had censorship problems from the distributors who decided the sex was too much, and the language was too vulgar, and so on. And it's W.H. Smith and Son were the main distributors around the country, and also in quite large parts of the British Commonwealth, and New Worlds became a sort of cause, and there were questions asked in Parliament about why public money was being spent, because we had an Arts Council grant, so there's a lot of scandal, or the tabloid newspapers jumped on it, and they were just it was just crazy for a while.
Et c'était spécialement sur vos écrits à vous, c'était sur tous les écrits qui étaient disponibles dans New Worlds. Est-ce qu'il y avait un auteur ou un genre qui était particulièrement censuré ou décrié?
No, it was individual writers. Like Norman Spinrad wrote a novel called Bugjack Baron.
Yes.
And I serialized it. And they really hated that. Even maybe because it was about the media and the lies it told, but they hated it. And they also, another writer who's less well known, called Langdon Jones, who's also the assistant editor on New Worlds. He wrote some brilliant, very experimental stories. His main enthusiasm was Messiaen, the French composer, and he wrote a story which included Messiaen and influenced by Messiaen's librettos and so on. And they objected to that too, because there was some. He had a conversation between Christ on the cross and a character. They were talking, and they objected to that. I mean, I think they actually just objected to it. They didn't have any idea what we were doing, but they saw some of the images, because by that time it was a large magazine and I specialized in running images of all kinds. I wanted the magazine to be like that. And I think some of the images probably upset them, and they decided they were pornographic or whatever. They weren't, I don't think, but that was their idea. So they began to put pressure on us, and eventually they stopped distributing us, so we lost. Then the press was so against the distributor, the press came out in favor of me, and in embarrassment they said, okay, we'll take you back. But it wasn't really. They didn't put the magazine on the on the front of the stands and so on. They did everything they could to destroy it. So it meant that by this time I wasn't just supporting my family. I was also supporting all the New Worlds writers, because I had to. It was the only way of paying them. So for about 3 years, I paid for the whole thing to keep going, but it became a very expensive exercise, and ultimately, with children growing up and so on, I just couldn't keep supporting everybody. But that was that was how it happened.
Merci. On va peut-être passer à un autre sujet, et peut-être plus spécifiquement sur Elric, qui est évidemment votre personnage le plus célèbre, et notamment à travers le concept de multivers. Comment est-ce que cette idée de multivers est née pour vous, et comment est-ce que vous l'avez adaptée par la suite à tous ces romans qui d'ailleurs, même plus tard, au-delà des romans de Hawkmoon, de Corum, de Eric Eze, se retrouvent, on retrouve toujours des références, même dans Gloriana, même dans Mother London. Comment est-ce que cette idée est venue, et comment est-ce qu'elle a traversé toute votre œuvre?
Well, first of all, there was the idea of the eternal champion, of the character who recurs, is born again here and there, and has to deal with the forces of law and forces of chaos. And that I had when I was 17. I think I wrote the first version of that when I was 17. Then I wrote my first science fiction novel called The Sundered Worlds, again for Carnell in his magazine. And at the time, there was a great deal of talk about the Big Bang Theory and how the universe moved towards a state of entropy. So it was constantly thinning and growing more gaseous and so on, until it eventually effectively disappeared. And it was an idea so unpleasant. And I was not the only person, I'm sure of this. I reacted against that idea of essentially the dying universe. And just in the course of the novel, I had the character become aware of other universes outside our own universe. He had a kind of special power to sense the other universes. And at the same time, I had a situation where the universe, rather than expanding, was being dragged back into what we would now call a black hole. But of course, I had no idea of a black hole. But I had what was essentially a black hole. And so this was the disaster that was occurring to the universe, which had to be somehow solved or resisted. So I just thought of I don't know how, but it just came into my mind that there were other universes, an infinite number of universes that we couldn't see.
Connected. Des univers connectés les uns quand même, les uns avec les autres. Car vos personnages ont quand même...
the ones I wrote about were, but this was really an infinity of... and what the first character could see was all the universes at the same time. So he just saw it was just like a vast, scintillating jewels, packed with color and substance, because that's really what I like. I don't like the idea of space at all, and so I just did it instinctively. I think now that a number of people, including scientists, reacted against the notion of the entropic dying universe, and I think that multiverse theory in theoretical physics, as much as it came from me in writing fiction, was because of this philosophical refusal to believe that the universe was dying or that everything was dying. And I still suspect that all of the physicists who are curious about string theory and M theory really have that as the root. They don't want there to be nothing. They want there to be something, and they'll prove it if they can by any means. And I'm happy with that. But there was one other scientist who, at the same time as I was writing about the multiverse, calling it the multiverse, his name I think was David Deutsch, I think. David Deutsch, maybe? Anyway, he was regarded as mad by the scientific community at the time. He was a physicist at Oxford, I think, but the most of the scientific community marginalized him. But of course now he's regarded as being the father of the whole thing. So, and somebody did ask in an interview him if he had the idea from me, because mine just slightly was ahead of his in terms of publication, and he said no, he'd never read it, but he liked the idea, and I mean, we were kind of common souls without knowing about one another at all, and that happens. I think it's the zeitgeist; it's a normal enough thing to happen. So that was the multiverse, and then, but with the Eternal Champion, I then had a structure, a background, if you like, in which to explore human character in different situations. So you could put the same character into very different situations. You could have any kind of world that you wanted to examine could exist in the multiverse. It was just the sense of capacity, of largeness, but at the same time of richness that I liked. But I also wanted. It was. I've mentioned this before, and again, I'm not comparing myself to Balzac, but I feel I know how Balzac came to write the Comédie humaine, and it happens naturally. You realize you're writing about one character in one book, then you start another book, and you realize it's the same character. You've called him a different name. And so you might as well use that character, because if you're doing that, if you're using a character who can occur in all kinds of entirely different books, including realistic books as well as fantastic, it enables you to carry more than one narrative. The character carries a huge number of narratives with him, so that every book you write, the reader is getting not just one narrative, or not just the narratives that you're putting in, say, the symbolic in symbolic way, or various other ways that you layer the narratives into a normal novel. Well, I do anyway. You have it builds a constantly enlarging narrative, so that the character has all kinds of experience to draw on. And that can become difficult to work with if you only keep it like that. But if you're also interested in how people behave, it enables you to put people into any situation, a real, very small situation, or a huge science fiction situation. So through the 80s and 90s, I was really bringing together ways of writing, of having the same character existing normally in both the super fantastic situation and in an entirely realistic situation. It just became a good technique, a very, very easy to, because you take the audience with you, or at least you take a large part of the audience with you. Some of them don't like, obviously, some of the characters that you write about, or don't like, they may only like the realistic fiction. I have readers who only read my non-fantasy. I also have, of course, readers who only read my fantasy. But it was my ambition to bring the two together. So, and other writers had the same ambition. Salman Rushdie did it. Michael Chabon recently. Pynchon again has done the same thing. It became really a very large modern movement to bring genres together, but also to destroy the notion of separate genres and of, science fiction over here, westerns over here, or whatever. And so I think in the last 30 or 40 years, slowly, many, many more authors have started to do this, to bring those together, so that the reader needn't really bother what kind of fiction they're reading, as long as they enjoy it. And I think it becomes not a matter of genre, but a matter of the individual writer that you enjoy. For instance, I enjoy Walter Mosley as a detective writer, as well as his other stuff. But Walter's part of that same notion of bringing together all the things that essentially the academics had put apart.
Le temps file très vite. On va passer peut-être à ma dernière question. Vous avez cité Balzac, Camus, l'existentialisme. Vous avez travaillé déjà avec plusieurs auteurs français, Fabrice Collin pour le dernier roman de Elric, Julien Blondel pour l'adaptation en bande dessinée. Quelle est votre relation avec la France ? Pourquoi avoir travaillé aussi souvent avec des Français ? Pourquoi avoir lu autant d'auteurs français ? Est-ce que vous sentez un petit peu français ?
Yes, I have. I started coming to France when I was 15. I think it's the thing that most young people do. The first, place they go if they're from London, they go to Paris. It's just natural to do that. And so that's what I did. I busked in Paris. I used to sit outside the the bookstore that's now called Shakespeare and Company, but it used to be called Le Mistral. That's another story. With a friend, and we used to busk. George Whitman, the guy who ran Le Mistral, would let us busk outside his shop because he knew we'd spend the money in the shop, which we did. I mean, as soon as we had enough money, we'd buy a book. So it was easy for him. And I don't know, the very first ever published Elric comic was by Philippe Drouet in '64, I think, soon after Elric had started. And Philippe had never read Elric. He'd only heard it from me, sort of telling him about
Pourtant, il a
it.
fait un travail absolument magnifique sur Elric, justement, qui est reconnu encore aujourd'hui. Mais il n'avait jamais lu Elric.
Oh, yes. No, he never read it. In fact, it was so different that I pinched material from him and used it. That I've always done that. I mean, I've always encouraged other people to do that too with my work. Yes, I mean, we had a very good relationship from a very early time with Philippe. When I first met Philippe, he was very skinny and very shy and crazy, really. And now he's become very valiant and, outward going and so on. A very different person, but still a very good artist. And we're still friends. And so a lot of my friendships, cultural friendships, if you like, I mean, were with French people. And one of the reasons that we moved to Paris is that we had more friends living in Paris than we had living in London anymore. So it was a very easy thing to do. I was really moving to friends when I moved there. And of course, I've written work with French writers, and I'm writing a book at the moment which is going to be published by Denoël first, and of course there's another comic I'm doing with Robin, the guy one of the guys on the current Glénat comic. I've always enjoyed working with French writers. I don't know what it is. It's because my language, as you can see here, my French is very, very bad, and I have almost no talent for language, but I'm constantly using language in my books and different kinds of language. And some of my characters are polyglots, probably because I'm not, And I love language, but I have very little learning capacity. I think we were talking about this before this interview. I just find it very hard to learn anything that I'm not absolutely 100% interested in for work, and that's it. At school, I was terrible. I had to make everything up. And I think there's a certain kind of creative imagination that is like that actually can put out, but has a very hard time bringing in at least formal education. That's why I'm such a bad driver. I mean, my wife won't let me drive at all. Because when I told this story too, when we were first together, she said, "I'm not going to be the only one to drive. You've got to take your test," because I'd driven, but not officially. And I'm very bad at tests. I'd always been bad at exams, tests. And so I got into the car and started driving, and the instructor said, "I don't know what the problem is. 2 or 3 lessons and you'll be perfect. You'll be ready for the test." And by the time I had the 5th lesson, he had me driving around the parking lot of the local supermarket, and he'd taken up smoking again. and I was terrible. I just got worse and worse and worse. And it's like it. I went to Alliance Française because I felt I ought to learn French. I mean, it's important to me. And I just, all that happened was I started to entertain the instructor. And I had to do a small exercise. And so all of the characters I took from Proust, particularly the female characters, because they're such strange, they're sort of masculine names often that are feminized. And she didn't know what I was talking about. And it's just I simply can't seem to sit down and learn properly. I do really try hard to learn, but it's almost impossible.
Merci beaucoup. Merci Michael Moorcock. On va peut-être passer maintenant, parce que le temps file vraiment très vite, aux questions du public. Alors il y a normalement un micro, et il y a une main qui se lève aussi, et le micro arrive.
Hello. I have a question about your newest book that came out, Sanctuary of the White Friars. Oh, yeah. I think this sequence, the first book in that, that's a mix of autobiographical stuff and fictional stuff. How did you mix that, and how did you decide when to use fact or when to use fiction? And was it difficult for certain things that you thought, I don't want to say that or so, and then, or did you, the fictional characters, is there a mix where characters are part fictional, part real, or how did you mix the fiction and the real?
It was very, very difficult. I went through a considerable amount of angst, considerable amount of depression too, because I was deliberately facing my own life and my own, if you like, moral involvement in certain things. So it was the hardest book I think I've ever had, well, definitely the hardest book ever to write. I've written more books that in some ways are more ambitious, but not as hard to write as this, because I was having to deal with my own emotions, obviously. Also my first wife, my children. And so I realized there were certain things I couldn't write about because they would be seen as critical by my children if they read it. And I've never criticized my first wife, for instance, and I wouldn't want to do that to them. So I had this very, very hard problem. Whether to use. I tried not to use characters that were very fictionalized. The names are usually very obvious in the book that you'll know who they are, but they're removed one step so that I can say some things without them necessarily being true. But I was also trying to mix that kind of very serious roman à clé to some extent, with the fantasy element, with the symbols and so on, plus what popular fiction had meant to me. So I have a part of London which is called Alsatia, which is based on it's a real place. It was a real place. It was called the Alsatia after Alsace because it was neither in one place or another. It didn't belong to either London or, in this case, the thieves. It was a thieves. It became a thieves' quarter. on the premises of the Carmelite monks. It had originally been a sanctuary, and it still had its sanctuary elements, so people could flee there to escape their enemies. And it's been written. It's always this quarter has always attracted writers. Walter Scott wrote about it, and various historical writers through the 19th century wrote a great deal about it. And into the 20th century, the early the rogue stories, the thieves stories they're called penny dreadfuls. That kind of popular fiction, which preceded the comics that I was interested in. So I was really writing, as well as writing about myself, my friends, my own failures as a person in some ways. I was also writing about popular fiction and what it meant, what it meant to me, what it meant in other ways. So it was, yes, very, very difficult to write. But the next one I think will be easier because there's even more truth in the second book. There are 3 books. I was writing 3 books, anyway, it was a difficult book to write.
Une autre question? Oui. Il était le premier.
Thanks. Hello. I was wondering if you are already tired to imagine one of your books being made into a film, like especially the Elric stories, or maybe another book of yours that you are still dreaming of to see it one day on the screen, or has that been an idea that was tiresome now? But
I've never had any ambition to see my work on the screen. They filmed the final program in the 70s, and I've written a couple of films, but they're disappointing. Even the very best movies now, I find disappointing. They don't match what I have in my head. So it's flattering and nice, and you get a certain buzz from seeing your own characters on the screen. But although there's been interest in Elric for most of the time he's existed, but only after Lord of the Rings was made, when effects no longer interfered with the story, when effects could be used to help the story along, did I really seriously decide to let anyone have Elric, for instance, as a character. And then the problem became the Weitz brothers, Chris Weitz, who did the Golden Compass. But this was before he directed the Golden Compass. He wanted to do it, and I was impressed by what he had to say to me. So Universal bought the rights through him, and for a long time Universal were going to do it. But the lawyers, unfortunately, could not understand the idea of the Eternal Champion. So they thought, they were buying everything. And I had to explain. I finally got through to them by saying, if you were buying Batman, would you expect to get Superman free, And that finally began to make a bit of sense. But it took so long to negotiate that in the meantime, Universal completely changed its structure and its employees. Chris went off to do the Golden Compass, still wants to do Elric, but after the Golden Compass, I wasn't sure I wanted him to do Elric. So, and currently there is a contract. I've signed a contract with, I've forgotten the guy's name, but he was the showrunner for The Walking Dead, to do it really probably as a TV series, but with an option to do a movie. So Elric should be done at some point fairly soon, probably for TV, and I'd rather it was done for TV. I think it would work better these days, you know, with Game of Thrones and so on. It's possible to do so much more than you could do. But otherwise, I really don't have any ambition. I sometimes have an ambition to write a new movie, a completely new movie, but not to have the characters filmed. I know there's a lot of good reasons for having them filmed, because you sell a lot more copies of the book. But no, it really hasn't been a particularly big ambition of mine. I'm sorry to say.
Merci beaucoup.
I shouldn't admit that really at a film festival, but.
Merci beaucoup. On me fait de grands signes. On me fait de grands signes pour me dire que le temps imparti est maintenant terminé. Michael Moorcock, thank you very much. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci. Thank you very much.